Chapter 8. Mountain Meadows Massacre. I fear, and I regret to say it, that with certain parties here there is a greater anxiety to connect Brigham Young and other church dignitaries with every criminal offense than diligent endeavor to punish the actual perpetrators of crime. Bancroft's History of Utah, page 56, statement made by Jacob Forney, Supt. of Indian Affairs. One of the most pathetic incidents in the history of the Utah Territory occurred in the fall of 1857 near Cedar City, Utah. It was an atrocious act of violence known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Anti-Mormons and apostates have sent worldwide a billowing mass of pages on this incident in their effort to destroy Mormonism or cast aspersion upon its doctrines. In their determination they have sometimes written the most absurd and wild fantasies imaginable. B. H. Roberts in his History of the Church wrote, "Anti-Mormon writers have been determined to fasten the crime upon the Church of the Latter-day Saints, or at least upon her leaders, and also, as a rule, holding that in some way Mormon doctrine and Mormon church policy was responsible for the crime. On the other hand, church people who in all good conscience and justly resent this imputation against their church and its leaders have been naturally slow to admit all the facts that history may insist upon as inevitable." CHC 4139. Massacres between the whites and Indians were not uncommon. Just 2 years before the Mountain Meadows Massacre, on September 2, 1855, General William Harney sent troops against an Indian settlement and wiped out 80 Indians, men, women, and children. It was this act that gave him the famous nickname of Squaw Killer. See Massacres of the Mountains by J. P. Dunn, Jr. Most of the anti-Mormon writers use the Mountain Meadows Massacre as an illustration of the blood atonement doctrine. This is inaccurate, however, as will be illustrated by relating a brief summary of that incident. On May 1, 1857, the Fancher party left Stifler Spring, Arkansas, for California. As the emigrant train moved along the countryside, it added new members for mutual protection against the many trials of the long trek. It grew to 40 wagons of over 100 people, mostly families from Arkansas and Missouri, and several thousand head of horses and cattle. Alexander Fancher had made 2 previous trips, so he was familiar with the route. When the train reached St. Joseph, Missouri, a band of Missouri wildcats joined the caravan. They were some of the roughest elements of an already rough country and caused several families to leave the original party, which was now nearly 150 in number. The wildcats poisoned several springs along the trail in Missouri, an act that should have called for some rebuke from the wagon master, but it was either just merely tolerated or went unnoticed. The Fancher party was generally of upright conduct and language, so the wildcats from Missouri were not only an affront to them, but would be a primary influence in the fatal catastrophe to come. Stenhouse, in his books Rocky Mountain Saints and Tell It All, confirms that these 2 parties were traveling together. Eli Kelsey came with the company from Fort Bridger to Salt Lake City and said the train was divided into 2 parts, the first a rough and ready set of men, regular frontier pioneers, the other a pig community, the members of which were all more or less connected by family ties. P.K. Jacoby, who traveled with this wagon tramp to Fort Bridger, said he left it because it had so many antagonistic elements in it. He said others decided to leave for the same reasons. Finally, Captain Fancher ordered the Missourians to advance ahead at a safe distance from the emigrant train. This procedure was followed all the way to Utah, according to Eli B. Kelsey, who joined the party in its last leg of the journey. He described the wildcats swearing vengeance against the Mormons and warned Captain Fancher that it was easy to provoke a difficulty. The whole country was excited over the news of the invading army. Rocky Mountain Saints, page 427. The Fancher train passed through Emigration Canyon and into Salt Lake City on August 5. They camped on the west bank of the Jordan River, where they stopped to purchase supplies. It was here that Charles C. Rich arrived and told Fancher to avoid the southern route to California. Captain Fancher turned down the suggestion, which was one of the worst mistakes he made on the trip. When the train left, they traveled through Provo, Payson, and finally reached Fillmore. The Missourians were leading the way and were becoming more and more enraged at the Mormons for not selling them additional supplies of grain, etc., only small amounts of perishable items. It must be remembered that a federal army was on its way out here, and food was a vital ingredient to survival. The Mormons had little to spare. Brigham Young explained the reason for the Mormons not selling grain. Counsel and advice were given to the citizens not to sell grain to the emigrants to feed their stock, but to let them have sufficient for themselves if they were out. The simple reason for this was that for several years our crops had been short. And the prospect was at that time that we might have trouble with the United States Army, then en route for this place, and we wanted to preserve the grain for food. The citizens of the territory were counseled not to feed grain to their own stock. No person was ever punished or called in question for furnishing supplies to the emigrants, within my knowledge. Affidavit of Brigham Young at Lee's trial, Deseret News, August 4, 1875. Historian B. H. Roberts added, everything was in a state of chaos in Utah. An army was within the borders of the territory on the east, the purpose of which was not clearly known. The territory was under martial law by proclamation of the governor de facto, Brigham Young, and the people were making preparations for the destruction of their settlements and another flight into the wilderness. CHC 4167. When they were unable to satisfy their demands for supplies, the Missourians vent their feelings on the Mormons. In Fillmore, the Wildcats were saying that the U.S. troops would kill every damn Mormon in Utah. They hoped they could do so, and that they would like to help them to do the job. Letter from John A. Ray to the Mountaineer, dated December 4, 1859. They certainly were not trying to make friends or influence any Mormons. One of these Wildcats wrote in a letter to a friend, "Fire and sword, tar and feathers, are the only arguments that can be used against Mormonism." As rough as they sounded, they couldn't have been all bad. One fellow said that they named their two leading oxen, Brigham and Heber. In Fillmore they threatened the destruction of the town, and boasted of their depredations on the Mormons, when they had been in Missouri and Illinois. Laban Morrill and Joel White later testified in the second trial of John D. Lee, that some of the emigrants had even boasted that they had killed old Joe Smith. Bancroft quotes John D. Lee as saying that they also boasted of having the very pistol with which the prophet Joseph Smith was murdered, and had threatened to kill Brigham Young and all the apostles. All their trumpeting and bellowing were not enough to ruffle the Mormons, who were used to it. As the adage goes, sticks and stones may break bones, but names can never hurt. Nearly every wagon train through Utah gave vent to their emotional feelings towards Mormonism, and this wagon train didn't create much of a stir either. It was not until they were near Fillmore that trouble began. Bancroft, the noted historian and non-Mormon, wrote, toward the end of August the Wildcats arrived at Corn Creek, some 15 miles south of Fillmore, where they encamped for several days. In this neighborhood, on a farm set apart for their use by the Mormons, lived the Pavance Indians, who, as the saints allege, the emigrants attempted to poison by throwing arsenic into one of the springs and impregnating their own dead cattle with strychnine. Bancroft's History of Utah, page 547. This has been well documented, and others have also testified of the same fact. George A. Smith, a member of the Legislative Council of the Territory, made a report that included this incident. While camping at the sink of Corn Creek, 15 miles beyond Fillmore, they poisoned the springs and the body of an ox which had died. The carcass of the ox was eaten by a band of Paiutes from the desert, who were on a visit to the Pavantes. I was informed, by the people living at Meadow Creek, the nearest settlers to Corn Creek, that a considerable number of cattle also died from the poisoning of the water. Some of these cattle were fat, and the owners tied them up to save the tallow. A son of Mr. Robinson, of Fillmore, was poisoned from the handling of the meat, and died. History of Brigham Young Manuscript, August 17, 1858, page 929. This account agrees with John D. Lee's statement to Indian agent Jacob Forney, in which he said that about 20 Indians and some cattle died from drinking the poisoned water, and Indians from eating the poisoned meat. Another statement about Corn Creek was later written by Thomas Waters Cropper, who was 15 years old at that time and was living in Fillmore. In company with several other boys, I was up on the benches when we saw the unusual sight of an emigrant train. We ran down to where they were. They dared us to ride one of their wild steers, and I got on it, and it dashed into Catalan's Mill Pond, which caused them a lot of merriment. There appeared to be two companies of them joined together for safety from the Indians. One company, which was mostly men, called themselves the Missouri Wildcats. I heard one of them make the brag that he helped a mob and killed Joe Smith, and he further said, "I would like to go back and take a pop at Old Brig before I leave the territory." They moved on over to what was known as the Big Spring on the Corn Creek Sloughs. A lot of the Canosh Indians came to their camp to beg and trade. One man insisted on examining an Indian's bow and arrows, but the Indian refused and jabbed an arrow into the man's breast. The man whipped out a revolver and shot the Indian dead. They poisoned the spring, and a number of cattle died around the spring. The Indians ate some of the meat, and several Indians died from the effects. Mountain Meadows Massacre, by Juanita Brooks, page 47. And from another source, the company there at Corn Creek poisoned the most of an ox, which they gave the Pav and Indians to eat, causing 4 of them to die immediately, besides poisoning a number more. The company also poisoned the water where they encamped, killing the cattle of the settlers. This unguided policy, planned in wickedness by this company, raised the ire of the Indians, which soon spread through the southern tribes, firing them up with revenge till blood was in their path, and as the breach, according to their tradition, was a national one, consequently any portion of the nation was liable to atone for that offense. Mormonism Unveiled, pages 254 to 255. Bancroft later reported other depredations in his History of Utah. Isaac C. Hite, Major in Nauvoo Legion under Colonel Dame, said that they had burned fences and destroyed growing crops, poisoned water springs, and raped some of the Mormon women. They also boasted of reaching California to raise enough of an army to come back and kill every GD Mormon, man, woman and child they could find in Utah. Page 549. In Beaver there were more difficulties with the company and the Indians. William Ashworth related an intervention by a bishop to keep peace between the two. A man from the camp came through the sagebrush. He had a gun and was apparently hunting rabbits. There were some strange Indians in town, and one of them fired a shot at this man, but did not seem to hurt him, as he turned and ran back towards the camp. This incident caused quite a commotion in the town. The bishop and a number of the other men were gathered to learn the cause of the trouble. They met the Indians who were from Corn Creek. This seemed to be the headquarters for the Indians in that part of the country. The Indians said the men of the Merrycats, Americans, while encamped at Corn Creek, poisoned a mule that had died, and also a spring, and the Indians had been made sick by eating the mule and drinking the water, and they were. Bishop, who was pretty well versed in Indian lore, sympathized with them, but told them they must not harm the emigrants, as there were lots of innocent women and children in the company, but with all the reasoning and persuading the Indians were determined to revenge themselves. Autobiography of William B. Ashworth, typescript copy in BYU Library. One of the Massaurians openly boasted of his participation in the Haun's Mill massacre, another claimed he was carrying the gun that killed Joseph Smith, and another admitted to the responsibility for the death of Apostle Parley P. Pratt. Just before the caravan had left Arkansas, Apostle Pratt had been killed by a mob of men in that state. Bancroft gives this account. His path was barred by 2 of McLean's friends until McLean himself with 3 others overtook the fugitive, when he fired 6 shots at him, the balls lodging in his saddle or passing through his clothes. McLean then stabbed him twice with a bowie knife under the left arm, whereupon Parley dropped from his horse, and the assassin, after thrusting his knife deeper into the wounds, seized a derringer belonging to one of his accomplices, and shot him through the breast. The party then rode off, and McLean escaped unpunished. Pratt lived long enough to give instructions as to his burial and the disposition of his property. Bancroft's History of Utah, page 546. These boasts were only irritants, but cattle tramping through the grain fields, killing chickens and stealing, really aroused the Mormons' anger. To destroy crops, which is the only means of livelihood for many of these people, was near kin to destroying the people themselves. At Parowan news of the emigrants and their hostilities preceded them, such as the poison springs in Millard County. Therefore, the gates were closed, and they refused to do business with the emigrants. By now the Indians were up in arms. On September 4, 1857, the train reached Cedar City, which at that time was a large outpost, but fast becoming a city. Less than 1,000 people were in the area. Again the train was told they could not buy any goods. In retaliation the Massaurians rode into the middle of the town and shot at the citizens, wounding several. Some of the buildings were broken into and robbed. The town granary, or bishop's storehouse, was also broken into and robbed. On their way out of town one of the Massaurians waved a gun over his head and said that it was one that had killed Joe Smith and had 1 bullet left for old Brigham. San Francisco Daily Bulletin, March 24, 1877, when the camp settled for the night, 3 miles from Cedar City, they tore down fences for firewood and allowed several hundred cattle to feed on the unharvested crops. The whole city was riled up over the lawlessness, and they were clamoring for a military arrest of the Massaurians. A stake high council met in Parowan on Sunday, September 6, and several resolutions were considered. 1. To allow them to continue to California with the hope that they would not create any more trouble. 2. To treat them as enemies of war and deal with them in that manner. 3. To send word to Brigham Young and wait for his decision in how to handle the situation. By evening the final decision was to send word to Brigham Young for advice, as suggested by Elias Morris, the youngest member there. The next day John Haslam started for Salt Lake City to meet with Brigham Young. James Haslam later testified in court that between 5 and 6 o'clock on Monday, September 7, 1867, he was ordered by Isaac C. Haight to start for Salt Lake City and with all speed deliver a letter or message to Brigham Young. He arrived at 11 a.m. on the following Thursday and 4 hours later was on his way back with the answer. As he set forth, Brigham said to him, "Go with all speed, spare no horse flesh. The emigrants must not be meddled with, if it takes all Iron County to prevent it. They must go free and unmolested." Bancroft's History of Utah, page 567. William Barton, who was present at the Parowan meeting, said that after that agreement was made, another strange council meeting took place. In his own words, the council then dismissed but later with some occasion a consultation of three consisting of I.C. Haight, W.M. H. Dame and another man was held by the east gate of the Parowan fort wall. The three sat upon a pile of bark hence known in certain circles as the Tan Bark Council. Right there and then the whole program was changed and it was decided to destroy the whole company. Bro. Barton saw the three in consultation himself, but heard not what we said, but Isaac C. Haight afterward told Barton that that was the decision, and Haight said to Barton afterward, "There is when we did wrong, and I would give a world if I had it, if we had abided by the decision of the council, but alas, it is too late." William Barton, Mountain Meadow Massacre File, Church Historian's Office. John D. Lee, a local resident at this time, later made a similar statement that agreed with Barton's by saying that Haight had met with Colonel Dame, also of the Nauvoo Legion, and they had concluded that this emigrant camp must be used up. It seems that Haight and Higbee came to Parowan for a meeting with Dame. A young boy taking care of the horses said the men came out of the house and walked over to the stable, and there mentioned what the council decided, whereupon another said, "I don't care what the council decided. My orders are that the emigrants must be done away with." Higbee was a messenger, and when he came to Lee the report was, according to him, "It is the orders of the President Haight that all the emigrants must be put out of the way." President Haight has counseled with Colonel Dame, or had orders from him to put all of the emigrants out of the way. None who are old enough to talk are to be spared. Confessions of John D. Lee, page 232. However, originally one of John D. Lee's first orders from Major Haight and Colonel Dame was compromise with Indians if possible by letting them take all the stock and go to their homes and let company alone, but on no conditions you are not to precipitate a war with Indians while there is an army marching against our people. As Indian farmer and a major in the Legion, I trust you will have influence enough to restrain Indians and save the company. If not possible, save women and children at all hazards. W.M. H. Dame, Colonel Commanding Iron Military District, Mountain Meadows Massacre, page 88. Lee later wrote an explanation for the reason that they got involved and took part with the Indians rather than the emigrants. "When I reached the camp, I found the Indians in a frenzy of excitement. They threatened to kill me unless I agreed to lead them against the emigrants and help them kill them. They also said they had been told that they could kill the emigrants without danger to themselves, but they had lost some of their braves, and others were wounded, and unless they could kill all the Merrycats as they called them, they would declare war against the Mormons and kill everyone in the settlements." Confessions of John D. Lee, page 226. It should be noted that the whites in this area were outnumbered by Indians at about a 4-to-1 ratio. To keep friendly with them was difficult even in better times. Lee was satisfied that the Missourians should pay for their crimes and seemed eager to initiate war upon the train and bragged that he had Indians enough around him to wipe the whole of them out of existence. Elias Morris to Andrew Jensen, February 2, 1892, Lee left Cedar for Harmony to make powwow with the Indians over the matter. Haight also sent Samuel Knight and Dudley Leavitt to Santa Clara to confer with the Indians there. The entire caravan had reached Mountain Meadows late Monday evening. It was a hot September and there was not much water along the way. According to one report, the Missourians wanted to go on their own and not lose so much time with the slow-moving Arkansas travelers. On the morning of September 8, Indians moved towards the camp to make war. On the way they found and killed 10 emigrant herdsmen before they could get back to the safety of their party. About this time, John D. Lee was to join the Indians, disguised as one of the war party. The wagon train formed a circle and dug in with as many rocks, boards and dirt as could be hastily gathered for additional protection. The battle soon became a standoff with both sides suffering losses. By noon the Indians could see no advantage in continuing their attack, so they fell back in retreat with their dead and wounded. Lee wanted to recruit more Indians for the war and left for the Santa Clara Valley. On his way he met Sam Knight and Dudley Levitt, who told him that the Santa Clara Indians could not be persuaded to join the fight. Meanwhile, back at the emigrant camp, the survivors were desperate for water, food, medical supplies, and military support. 3 men volunteered to seek help from the Mormons at Cedar City. Young William Aiden, who left the company with 2 others to get help from the Mormons, was shot from his horse. His companions were wounded and followed by Indians until they, too, were killed. Haig called a council of war with his militia, declaring that the Arkansas Party was to be destroyed. So Major John M. Higbee left the fort with about 25 men in this company, the party doubling in size as it journeyed to the Meadows, with new recruits volunteering or commanded to join their ranks. On the morning of September 11, William Bateman, with a white flag of truce, rode up to the Arkansas wagon train. Bateman told Fancher that further fighting with the Indians would only lead to calamity. He said that the Nauvoo Legion was prepared to escort the emigrants through the Indians' territory. One stipulation, however, was necessary before they could expect any help: they must all surrender their arms and ammunition to the militia. Fancher said he would have to give it serious consideration. Later that afternoon, John D. Lee came to the camp with a flag of truce and entered their hasty fortress. Lee said he saw many dead and wounded from the Indian attack. I sat down on the ground in the corral, near where some young men were engaged in paying the last respects to some person who had just died of a wound. A large, fleshy old lady came to me twice and talked while I sat there. She related their troubles, said that 7 of their number were killed and 46 wounded on the first attack, that several had died since. She asked me if I was an Indian agent. I said, in a sense I am, as the government has appointed me farmer to the Indians. San Francisco Daily Bulletin, March 24, 1877. Lee reiterated to them the dangers of trying to fight the Indians without the aid of the militia. Fancher finally agreed to Lee's arrangement and surrendered their arms. Lee directed the emigrants to proceed in 2 main groups. The Iron County Militia Nauvoo Legion separated the men from the women and children, the men walking in the rear of the column, flanked by the armed military. One of the men involved in the massacre, Daniel S. McFarland, made a written statement in 1896 concerning his part in the affair. When we reached the Meadows, the Indians were still fighting the immigrants. About this time Lee got an express from Colonel W.M. H. Dane telling him to treat the Indians in some way and let the immigrants go and the natives take part of their stock and go to their homes. When we came to where Lee was, he and Klingon Smith were talking to some of the chiefs who seemed very much excited. Higbee asked Lee what the Indians were saying. He answered, "They say Lee told them we were at war with the Maricats, and you sent for all of us to come and bring our warriors and help you fight them, and now you want us to take part of their stock and go home and let them go, and you know some of our men have been shot, and my warriors are mad and their blood is up. Some of you want to take their part. We will fight you as well as them if you don't help us to get them out of their fort." Lee said further that himself and Klingon Smith had talked the matter over and come to the conclusion, under the circumstances, that we had to make our appearance of helping them or we must fight them, and the latter we cannot think of doing. John M. Higbee said, "Is there no way that the women and children can be saved?" Lee said, "The Indians agreed not to molest the women and children, if Lee would get the men out, so they could get at them." Then Higbee said, "Is there no way to satisfy the Indians and save the immigrants?" Klingon Smith said, "No, we have got to do as Lee says." Then Lee spoke up in an important slurring manner and said back, quote, "If any of you are too big cowards to appear to help the Indians, you need not shoot nor anything else. Only form a line, single file and march down to where I will call a truce and get the men out of their fort, and I will send the women and children ahead. The Indians will let them pass to half a mile or more, then the Indians will rush past you when the signal is given and take the men." Lee then said to Higbee and Klingon Smith, "You will see that my orders are strictly obeyed." So the line was formed and marched down to the road and up as he directed. After women and children had passed a half mile or more, then Klingon Smith gave the word halt signal agreed upon by Lee and Smith. When Klingon Smith fired his gun, our men dropped to the ground. The Indians rushed past them yelling, and like a tornado, they pounced upon their helpless victims, and all was over in a few minutes, and still as death, and not till then did we realize that treachery had been practiced when only a few small children had been saved. No one knew of the treachery beforehand unless Lee and Smith. Perhaps they did not, as Lee said it was the young bucks, and the old ones could not stop them. Mountain Meadows Massacre, Brooks, pages 91 to 92. After the massacre was all over, the letter arrived from Brigham Young to Isaac Haight which read, In regard to immigration trains passing through our settlements, we must not interfere with them until they are first notified to keep away. You must not meddle with them. The Indians we expect will do as they please, but you should try and preserve good feelings with them. There are no other trains going south that I know of. If those who are there will leave, just let them go in peace. September 10, 1857, Mountain Meadow Massacre File, Church Historian's Office. The letter would have to be answered. Brigham Young must be informed of what had transpired at Mountain Meadows. John D. Lee was nominated to report the whole tragedy to Brigham Young in person. However, news of the catastrophe reached Brigham Young before Lee arrived. When Brigham heard of it, he broke down in sobs. He knew the impact of such adverse news from the territory under which he had jurisdiction. The slaughter of over 100 people was horrible even in the Wild West. On his way to Salt Lake, Lee stopped in Fillmore where he met Jacob Hamblin and related to him the grisly massacre story of the Fancher wagon train. Jacob remembered President Young stating that they have a perfect right to pass. When I want martial law proclaimed, I will let you know. When Lee reached church headquarters, he reported the massacre and the extent of the losses of the emigrants. But it is evident that he did not inform President Young that any whites had a part in it. Wilford Woodruff, who was there when Lee made his report to Young, said that when Lee found it out, he took some men and went and buried their bodies. Woodruff Journal, September 29, 1857. A year later, Brigham Young commented on his knowledge of the white man's participation in the massacre. It is reported that John D. Lee and a few other white men were on the ground during a portion of the combat, but for what purpose, or how they conducted themselves, or whether, indeed, they were there at all, I have not learned. It is supposed that there were upwards of 200 warriors engaged in this massacre. A large number of the emigrants were killed with arrows, the residue with bullets, the Indians being armed with guns, as well as bows and arrows. History of Brigham Young, August 17, 1858. 2 years later, Brigham Young wrote a letter to Colonel Thomas L. Kane concerning this event in which he said, "Occasionally I perceive, from papers east and west, that the massacre of the Mountain Meadows still elicits more or less notice and comment, a good share of which is not very credible either to candor or veracity. Neither yourself, nor anyone acquainted with me, will require my assurance that had I been apprised of the intended onslaught at the Meadows, I should have used such efforts for its prevention as the time, distance, and my influence and facilities would have permitted. The horrifying event transpired without my knowledge, except from after report, and the thought of it ever causes shudder in my feelings. The facts of the massacre of men, women, and children are so shocking and crucifying to my feelings that I have not suffered myself to hear any more about them than the circumstance of conversation compelled. December 15, 1859, B. Young Papers, Church Historian's Office. The whole affair was now a matter of fear for the consequences to those involved. Everyone who had a hand in it wanted to avoid being accused, while everyone in political positions wanted to downplay it for the reprisals against their office. But neither care nor secrecy prevented the inevitable. The Indians began to tell smatterings of their participation in the massacre. They claimed that John D. Lee told them of the bad things that the wagon train had done, and persuaded them to attack it. They had made 3 attacks, but could not overcome the emigrants until Lee went in and told lies to get them to give up their weapons. The news of the massacre reached California within a few weeks and created no little stir. In San Francisco, on October 12, 1857, the newspapers were crying for the whole country to rally together and crush out this beastly heresy of Mormonism. The editorial appealed for the government to employ people to exterminate the Mormons. Soon the whole nation was aroused and clamoring for retribution. The Mormon community sank to an unprecedented low in its morale. Many of those who were involved in the attack moved away. Isaac C. Haight moved to Toquerville, Nephi Johnston went into the Zion National Park area, while others left for Salt Lake City. Cedar City diminished in size. The Utah Territory fell beneath a dark cloud of suspicion and sorrow. No one knew the lament and mourning that stung the Mormon people. And all this because of the wild actions of a few. But Mormonism, not unlike other religions or organizations, knew how much affliction and grief can come from a few. It was such a devastating period that everyone seemed at a loss of what to do. Even the government, with its military occupation of Utah, left the matter alone. Nearly a year after that tragic day, Judge Cradlebaugh finally decided to make an official inquiry into the events. It was then that Henry Higgins and Richard Cook came to the federal attorney general and told him that there were whites also involved in that massacre along with the Indians. Probably the most extensive report came from Jacob Forney, who went on a secret mission for the government to gather information. It was April 14, 1859, when Forney arrived at Mountain Meadows. He wrote, "I walked over the ground where it is supposed they were killed, the evidence of this being unmistakable from skulls and other bones and hair laying scattered over the ground. There they are busied, as near as I can ascertain, 106 persons, men, women and children, and from 1 to 2 miles further down the valley, 2 or 3 who, in attempting to escape, were killed, partly up the hill, north side of the valley, and there buried, and 3 who got near the Vegas or Muddy, in all 115. Deseret News, May 11, 1859. Forney continued on the California Trail to the settlement of Santa Clara. The whole trip was an uninformative search for any new evidence of what took place. He began his return and stopped at the Jacob Hamblin Ranch, where he picked up most of the surviving children who had originally been taken captives by the Indians and later gathered up by Jacob Hamblin and distributed to homes of Mormon settlers, where they had lived for over a year. Hamblin accompanied Forney to Harmony, where they found another child, Charlie Fancher, who was staying with John D. Lee. Forney told Lee that the federal government was going to conduct an investigation into the massacre to find out if the Mormons were involved. Lee denied knowing anything about the massacre or where any of the possessions could be found. Forney continued his journey back to Salt Lake City, whereupon he learned that Congress had appropriated $10,000 for the expenses of returning the children back to Arkansas to their nearest relatives. On June 26, 1859, 15 children were escorted by the Army back to Fort Leavenworth, where they were transported to various relatives. By now, the United States Attorney General, Jeremiah S. Black, took up the inquiry and wrote an open letter that was published in the Deseret News. The letter was addressed to Alexander Wilson. "I need not say that you are to make no distinction between Gentile and Mormon, or between Indian and white man. You will prosecute the rich and the poor, the influential and the humble with equal vigor, and thus entitle yourself to the confidence of all. This crime, by whomsoever committed, was one of the most atrocious that declared their unhesitating belief that the Mormons themselves committed this foul murder. All the circumstances seem, from the correspondence, to be enveloped in mystery." Day News, June 29, 1859. Federal troops came from California to the site of Mountain Meadows to gather information about what had taken place. Cedar City had reduced in size considerably, and it was difficult to gather information from anyone. A rough monument was raised over the massive grave. Cradlebaugh, the judge, was approached one night by an unidentified person who admitted having had a part in the destruction of the wagon train. He revealed the identity of about 25 other men who had been involved. A search was then put out for Lee, Haight, and others by the deputy marshals. But at this juncture of the investigation, President Buchanan sent word that the Army was no longer to participate in the affair. Judge Cradlebaugh reluctantly submitted to the order, knowing that this would mean the termination of his investigation in that part of the territory. The judge and federal troops left for Camp Floyd. As the column of soldiers traveled down the road near Nephi, Isaac Haight, J.M. Higbee, M.D. Hambleton watched from the hillside until they were well out of sight. But as fate would have it, the troops had been divided into 2 detachments, and when these 3 fugitives headed south, they ran directly into the second column. They were arrested near the Sevier River, handcuffed and kept under watch all night. However, a peculiar twist occurred the next morning. It seemed that the troops were only interested in examining the horses, as if they were suspicious of who the rightful owner might be. Not knowing who they had in their hands, the expedition freed the 3 prisoners. Haight later wrote in his diary, "After daylight they examined our horses and found them all right, and let us go on our way, and right glad we were to get away from them, as some of our bitterest enemies were in camp, among which was Judge Cradlebaugh." September 29, 1859, Isaac Haight diary. Judge Cradlebaugh left Camp Floyd for Carson City, where he arrived on June 4 to begin again his inquiries into the Mountain Meadows massacre. His efforts faded, and so did the investigation. Brigham Young had been replaced as governor of the territory, so he could not. Brigham Young sent George A. Smith to the new governor Cumming for an interview concerning the Mountain Meadows massacre and assured him that all possible assistance would be rendered the United States courts to have it thoroughly investigated. He also urged upon Governor Cumming the propriety of an investigation of this horrid affair, that, if there were any white men engaged in it, they might be justly punished for their crimes. Governor Cumming replied that President Buchanan had issued a proclamation of amnesty and pardon to the Mormon people, and he did not wish to go behind it to search out crime. Brother Smith urged that the crime was exclusively personal in its character and had nothing to do with the general officers of the territory, and, therefore, was a fit subject for an investigation before the United States courts. Mr. Cummings still objected to interfering on account of the president's proclamation. Brother Smith replied substantially as follows: "If the business had not been taken out of our hands by a change of officers in the territory, the Mountain Meadows affair is one of the first things we should have attended to when a United States court sat in southern Utah. We would see whether or not white men were concerned in the affair with the Indians." Jacob Hamblin, by James Little, pages 56 to 57. Rumors continued of the church's involvement in this atrocity. However, Bancroft said that they were ungrounded. Though there may have been cause for suspicion, there was no fair color of testimony, and there is none yet, that Brigham or his colleagues were implicated in the massacre. Apart from the hearsay evidence of Cradlebaugh of an officer in the Army of Utah, together with the statements of John D. Lee, there is no basis on which to frame a charge of complicity against them. Bancroft, History of Utah, page 560. 6 years after the massacre, Brigham Young was still decrying the slow process of convicting those who were responsible for the deed. Little did he know that it would continue for 7 more years when he said, "Nearly all of that company were destroyed by the Indians. That unfortunate affair has been laid to the charge of the whites. A certain judge that was then in this territory wanted the whole army to accompany him to Iron County to try the whites for the murder of that company of emigrants. I told Governor Cumming that if he would take an unprejudiced judge into the district where that horrid affair occurred, I would pledge myself that every man in the regions round about should be forthcoming when called for, to be condemned or acquitted as an impartial, unprejudiced judge and jury should decide. And I pledged him that the court should be protected from any violence or hindrance in the prosecution of the laws, and if any were guilty of the blood of those who suffered in the Mountain Meadow massacre, let them suffer the penalty of the law. But to this day they have not touched the matter, for fear the Mormons would be acquitted from the charge of having any hand in it. And our enemies would thus be deprived of a favorite topic to talk about when urging hostility against us." J.D. 10-110. Reporters, sectarian ministers, and anti-Mormons have never yet portrayed the Mountain Meadows massacre in as bad a light as that which the Mormon people viewed it. To have even the name of an individual Mormon connected with that gruesome act is enough to bring sadness to any other Mormon. Most murderers on death row have claimed membership in some church, but to criticize or condemn their church for the act of crime that he committed is not a reasonable argument. If everyone in that church was a murderer, then there would be some reason to believe that the church was responsible. We can't blame Catholicism for Hitler and Mussolini, nor the Jewish people for Stalin and Lenin, yet the anti-Mormon element blame Mormonism for what Lee, Haight and a few others did at Mountain Meadows. There are many justifiable and substantial reasons why Brigham Young or the church would not become involved with such a massacre. 1. Brigham would not have taken the risk of annihilation of such a large caravan of people with the United States Army on its borders. 2. He would not have made statements like he did to Van Vliet 2 days before the massacre if he knew that it was going to take place. 3. To try to wipe out over 100 people with so many Indians and whites involved and think that it would be kept a secret is beyond reasonable thinking. 4. To make an act of aggression or war against the Gentile people was not in the program of the Mormons. Their policy is never aggression, always defense. 5. To sanction the slaughter of innocent women and children has never been in the doctrine or history of the Mormon people. 6. Brigham Young would not have been as insistent as he was for the government to make an investigation if he were the principal executor of that order. 7. Of all the people that Brigham Young could have massacred and probably thought ought to have been, he wouldn't have picked an emigrant train that was almost out of the territory. 18 years after the massacre, the government finally took action in the case. The first grand jury was impaneled, and a joint indictment for conspiracy and murder was made against John D. Lee, William H. Dame, Isaac C. Haight, John M. Higbee, Philip Clinton Smith, and some others. Lee, in hiding, was captured in a hog pen at Pangitch. Court opened on the 12th of July, 1875. Lee had promised to make a full confession and turn state's evidence. In court, Lee detailed minutely the plan and circumstances of the tragedy and admitted that Haight and Higbee played a major part, and, as Bancroft noted, he said nothing as to the complicity of the higher dignitaries of the district attorney refused to accept his confession, so the case was brought to trial on the 23rd of July. The jury was out of court for 3 days on this occasion and failed to agree. A second trial was held in Beaver City between the 13th and 20th of September, 1876. The courtroom was packed with spectators anxious to see if Brigham Young was implicated. Attorney Howard said that he could produce evidence that would show that Brigham Young had not known of the matter until after it was over, and that Lee had misrepresented the facts of the massacre. All of the lawyers agreed that it was Lee being tried, not the church. Furthermore, they were not prosecuting anyone else who had been innocently lured into that situation on the Meadows. Nephi Johnson testified that he saw the massacre from atop a nearby hill and saw Lee and Smith as the dominating people in the affair. Samuel Knight testified that he had seen Lee kill a woman. Samuel McMurdy said that he saw Lee shoot one of the women and 2 or 3 of the sick or wounded who were in the wagons. But the testimony that was the most persuasive was that of Jacob Hamblin. Hamblin testified that his Indian boy Albert told him about 2 girls who had hidden in the bushes and were discovered and killed by Lee and the Indians. Also, he had shown Hamblin the bodies of the 2 girls, which were some distance from the rest. Hamblin concluded his statement that he had heard the story of the death of these 2 girls himself from Lee when he was on his way to Salt Lake City to report the massacre to Brigham Young. Lee wrote to his wife from jail in Beaver on September 21, 1876, and said that old Jacob Hamblin, the fiend of hell, testified against me about an Indian chief who brought the girls to me and wanted to know what was to be done with them. That I replied that they was too old to live and would give evidence and must be killed. The old hypocrite thought that now was his chance to wreak his vengeance on me by swearing away my life. Journals of John D. Lee, page 242. On September 20, the case was given to an all-Mormon jury who took 3.5 hours to bring in a verdict of guilty. While in prison, Lee wrote an account that was to be published many times. I soon learned that Colonel Dame, Judge Lewis of Parowan, and Isaac C. Haight, with several others, had arrived at the Hamblin Ranch in the night, but I do not know what time they got there. After breakfast, we all went back in a body to the Meadows to bury the dead and take care of the property that was left there. When we reached the Meadows, we all rode up to that part of the field where the women were lying dead. The bodies of men, women, and children had been stripped entirely naked, making the scene one of the most loathsome and ghastly that can be imagined. Knowing that Dame and Haight had quarreled at Hamblin's that morning, I wanted to know how they would act in sight of the dead, who lay there as the result of their orders. I was greatly interested to know what Dame had to say, so I kept close to them, without appearing to be watching them. Colonel Dame was silent for some time. He looked all over the field, and was quite pale, and looked uneasy and frightened. I thought then that he was just finding out the difference between giving and executing orders for wholesale killing. He spoke to Haight and said, I must report this matter to the authorities. How will you report it? Said Haight. Dame said back, I will report it just as it is. Yes, I suppose so, and implicate yourself with the rest? Said Haight. No, said Dame. I will not implicate myself, for I had nothing to do with it. Haight then said, that will not do, for you know if I will stand it. You are as much to blame as anyone, and you know that we have done nothing except what you ordered done. I know that I have obeyed orders, and by I will not be lied on. Colonel Dame was much excited. He choked up and would have gone away, but he knew Haight was a man of determination and would not stand any foolishness. As soon as Colonel Dame could collect himself, he said, I did not think there were so many of them, or I would not have had anything to do with it. I thought it was now time for me to chip in, so I said, Brethren, what is the trouble between you? It will not do for our chief men to disagree. Haight stepped up to my side, a little in front of me, and facing Colonel Dame. He was very mad and said, The trouble is just this. Colonel Dame counseled and ordered me to do this thing, and now he wants to back out and go back on me, and by he shall not do it. He shall not lay it all on me. He cannot do it. He must not try to do it. I will blow him to hell before he shall lay it all on me. He has got to stand up to what he did like a little man. He knows he ordered it done, and I dare him to deny it. Colonel Dame was perfectly cowed. He did not offer to deny it again, but said, Isaac, I did not know there were so many of them. That makes no difference, said Haight. You ordered me to do it, and you have got to stand up for your orders. Confessions of John D. Lee, pages 245 to 247. Historian Juanita Brooks, in her extensive and well-documented account of this calamity, tends to absolve John D. Lee of much that was brought against him, and justly so. If Lee was to be executed, then there were others who should have gone with him. But within the same month as the massacre, Lee was told by Brigham Young that there was innocent blood of women and children spilled. Lee countered that he did not think there was a drop of innocent blood in the camp, for he had 2 of the children in his house, and he could not get but one to kneel down in prayer time, and the other would laugh at her for doing it, and they would swear like pirates. Wilford Woodruff Diaries, September 29, 1857. He was either justifying the action of the Indians or subconsciously pacifying his own conscience, but in either case he was mistaken. Who should we blame for the tragedy? A. The wagon train for killing the Indians and getting them on a warpath. B. The Mormons for aiding the Indians in the massacre. C. The Gentiles for bringing the Mormons to such a frenzy because of their mobs, assassinations, drivings and further pushing an army at them. D. Lee because he betrayed the company and lured them into the massacre. B. Brigham Young because all of this happened under his jurisdiction of the territory. F. Or Colonel Dame and Major Haight for giving the final plan and executing order. Everyone usually settles for a common accusation against the Mountain Meadows massacre is that it is the result of the Mormon doctrine of blood atonement. This is a false assumption for numerous reasons. For proper compliance to that doctrine, it should be justified by law, executed by a court, approved by authorities, guilt-proven, etc., etc. Other factors involved make it unacceptable because Indians instigated it. Men and women who knew nothing of what it was about were killed, as well as children who were innocent of any crimes. For a Mormon act of blood atonement, it was completely out of order. There may have been a few men in that camp that deserved capital punishment, but certainly not the whole caravan. To conclude, Lee was sentenced to death, with sentence to be carried out on the 23rd of March, 1877, on the Mountain Meadows massacre site. Strangely enough, Isaac C. Haight, William Dame, and all the others who engaged in this affair escaped a similar fate. Lee was allowed to choose the mode of execution and said, "I want to be shot." A few days before his execution, Lee finished his confession in which he wanted to throw the burden of the crime on his accomplices, especially on Dame, Haight, and Higbee, and to incriminate Brigham Young and the High Council. However, just before being executed he said, "I use my utmost endeavors to save them, the wagon train, from their sad fate. I freely would have given worlds, were they at my command, to have averted that evil." However, on at least 3 occasions he could have but didn't. Lee was taken out to the Mountain Meadows by the United States Marshal, William Nelson, the district attorney and a military guard. Some rough pine boards were nailed together for a coffin near a dugout grave site. Asked if he had anything to say, he replied, "I have but little to say this morning. It seems I have to be made a victim must be had, and I am the victim. I studied to make Brigham Young's will my pleasure for 30 years. See now what I have come to this day. I have been sacrificed in a cowardly, dastardly manner. I cannot help it, it is my last word, it is so. I do not fear death, I shall never go to a worse place than I am now in. I ask the Lord my God, if my labors are done, to receive my spirit." Bancroft's History of Utah, page 570. The marshal stepped forward and placed a handkerchief over his eyes and released his hands from the manacles, which was his last request. He sat upon his own coffin and said, "Let them shoot the balls through my heart. Don't let them mangle my body." The command to shoot was given and Lee fell back on his coffin. Bancroft said that God was more merciful to him than he had been to his victims. And, over that spot the curse of the Almighty seemed to have fallen. The luxuriant herbage that had clothed the 20 years before had disappeared, the springs were dry and wasted, and now there was neither grass nor any green thing, save here and there a copse of sagebrush or of scrub oak, that served but to make its desolation still more desolate. Bancroft's History of Utah, page 569. The last victim of Mountain Meadows was then buried, but the specter of that tragedy lives on.